Hey everybody, Hakuna Matata, and welcome back to Anna Reads. I'm sorry, this is as close to a Lion King Disney bound as we're getting today because unfortunately I don't think I have anything that could pass for a believable or fashionable Lion King Disney bound. So I just threw on my best sweatshirt and my big buddy Simba from my, let's see, fifth grade trip to Walt Disney World is accompanying me today. So let's jump right into chapter 19 of Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. I have me a glass of wine because it's 5 o'clock somewhere and it's definitely 5 o'clock here. Let's see, chapter 19. After a quarter century as a producer of animated cartoons, Walt Disney in the early 1950s demonstrated his versatility with a wide variety of films. He applied the same principles he had used as a cartoon maker. Prepare the stories thoroughly. Create interesting characters. I think he'd like you. Above all, make it read. Nothing ambiguous, nothing uncertain. Walt even carried over the methods of animation. All of the live-action films were prepared on storyboards, with each scene, each camera angle sketched on paper before anything was put on film. Thus, Walt could perceive the pacing of the movie, juxtaposing action sequences with exposition to maintain audience interest while furthering the plot. Now, I don't know much about filmmaking other than being in background, but that sounds like a good way to go about many, many things. Walt's modus operandi had changed little from the days when he had only cartoon shorts to supervise. He once described his function in a homely story. My role? I was stumped one day when a little boy asked, "Do you draw Mickey Mouse?" I had to admit that I do not draw any more. Then do you think up all the jokes and ideas? No, I said, I don't do that. Finally he looked at me and said, "Mr. Disney, what do you do?" Well, I said, sometimes I think of myself as a little bee. I go from one area of the studio to another and gather pollen and sort of stimulate everybody. I guess that's the job I do. I think that's fair. That's a good explanation for a kid, you know? He continued his phantom tours of the studio on weekends. I go over and just float around at my leisure when I have no pressure on me, he said. I sit down and look at the story sketches and things. The boys know I do that, and the boys pull all kinds of tricks to find out whether I've been there, you know. They arrange papers in a certain way on the chairs, and when they arrive in the morning, they say, "Well, Walt wasn't in this weekend," but they don't know that I put the papers right back where they were. You know, that reminds me of a little story on the set of a certain show about not living folks who manage independent bipedal locomotion. They were stashing us briefly in the set of The Sanctuary, and I found a whole pile of National Geographics that were near identical to the collection my dad had when I was growing up. And all of a sudden, I swear I was 8 years old again. I was piled up next to a folding cot, just devouring Nat Geo after Nat Geo. And I put them up when I was done. I absolutely put them away when I was done. Well, then a set dresser came screaming to our AD, "Who moved all these National Geographics?" And, you know, of course I came clean. I said, "Well, I'm very sorry. I put them away when I was done reading them. You see, my dad was a great Nat Geo enthusiast, and this was like seeing my childhood again." You know, thankfully they were quite nice about it, but they said to me, "Next time we'll show you a picture of how they were before so you can put them up exactly like that." You see, I had put them away as I had as a child, volume, 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 April, May, June, etc., you know, in order. Well, they weren't supposed to be in order. They were supposed to be set decoration. And it was just really nice of them not to go off on me. "Sorry, Roger." There was no waste motion in Walt's operations. He rarely indulged in small talk before a conference. When he strode into the room, discussion began immediately. When the meeting was over, he left as swiftly as he had entered, without goodbyes. Since he dealt so often with intangibles, his instructions in story meetings could be imprecise, and veteran studio hands endeavored to fathom Walt's thinking. Said Wilfred Jackson, in a conference, he'd make a passing remark about something, and I'd forget about it. Later, when we looked at the material in the sweatbox, he'd complain, "Why wasn't that in? We discussed it, didn't we?" The big part of my career was to decide when Walt meant it and when he didn't mean it. I could never tell what he was just trying to get me to think. "Don't do something just because I told you," he'd say. I swear he's as snuggly as a real cat. He's real, he's just not live. I have a velveteen rabbit up back that away who can back me up on that. Once, Walt had described a fight sequence for a Mickey Mouse short, acting out all the parts. Jackson was confident that he could capture what Walt wanted. But when Walt saw the animation, he complained, "You got the tail all wrong. Look, Mickey's mad all over. His tail is tense, not a limp thing hanging there. What's the matter, Jack? Didn't we talk this over?" Walt's contributions to the live-action scripts took a different form. He no longer needed to propound the appearance and action of each character. The actors would supply their own appearances and actions. He concerned himself primarily with story construction, dialogue, and the staging of scenes. At the beginning of a story conference, producers and writers recognized they had failed when Walt handed over the script with the comment, "Well, I've read this thing." Oh, that was a crack, I'm sorry. Then turned to another topic of conversation. More often, he sat down at the low square table in his conference room and began analyzing the script's merits and defects. He had usually done his homework the night before, marking changes and suggestions in a red or blue pencil. Sometimes his contributions were specific. He would compose 2 or 3 pages of dialogue to improve the timing and sense of a scene. Often he suggested general things. "This scene isn't playing. I believe in leaving something to the audience's imagination, but you're making them play every climax off camera. The picture starts too slowly. Jump to page 4 and begin there." Excuse me. His suggestions were not final. He was willing to listen to argument from the producer and writer, but there were 2 things he disliked: being interrupted when he was in the midst of interpreting a scene, and having someone argue a point that he had rejected at a previous meeting. I can understand that. It's done. What's done is done. Walt had an instinct for recognizing when a film project was not going well. Sometimes there were stories that defied solution, and he simply dropped them. Months, perhaps years later, he picked up the project and started all over again. By this time, his creative subconscious may have provided a solution. Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan were examples of films with long histories. A Hiawatha film feature was another. It metamorphosed over a period of 20 years, and when a story man lacked an assignment, Walt instructed, "Put him on Hiawatha." But despite all efforts, Hiawatha was never produced. That's probably all to the good that I do not feel would have aged well. Lady and the Tramp dated back to 1937 when Walt started work on a story about a sedate cocker spaniel. Then he read a short story, Happy Dan, the Whistling Dog, by Ward Green, an editor for King Features, distributor for the Disney comic strips. Happy Dan was a free soul, a mutt with loyalty to no man. Walt told Green, "Your dog and my dog have got to get together." Green agreed, And in 1943, he wrote a story called Happy Dan, the Whistling Dog, and Miss Patsy, the Beautiful Spaniel. Walt started developing a script, then dropped the project, reviving it almost a decade later. He insisted on calling it Lady and the Tramp over the opposition of green and RKO salesmen. That's what it's about, a lady and a tramp, Walt declared. Several years ago, I was part of a burlesque troupe in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and my troupe leader and I had a creative difference over an act I wanted to do. It was supposed to be for Goddess Night, and as far as I'm concerned, Ella Fitzgerald, the First Lady of Song, was and remains a goddess in her own right. So to celebrate the divine feminine, I wanted to do a burlesque act to The Lady is a Tramp. You know, Ella Fitzgerald's cover of that. Well, my troupe leader didn't like that. So what I wanted to do then was He's a Tramp. Peggy Lee's wonderful composition for Lady and the Tramp. Well, it turned out tramp was the word our director had an objection to. And I said, "Are you kidding me? That's the dog's name. That's his name. That's the joke here." Well, I ended up going on to Peggy Lee's Fever, and it's become one of my signature acts. After the constrictions of dealing with two classics, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, Walt felt comfortable with a subject that he could mold to his own preferences. He was at his dramatic best in a story meeting about the scene in which the tramp kills a rat that is menacing the baby in Lady's house, which does in fact have roots in a rather terrible true story, but I'm not going to get into that right here. Lady's barking, trying to get Jim's attention, and then you see the light coming, his shadow coming up. She's waiting when the door opens. She barks, starts up the stairs. He tries to grab her, says, "Girl, what's the matter?" Jim Dear chains Lady to a doghouse outside in the rain because of her barking. She has to get Tramp's attention instead. She says, "A rat." Tramp says, "Where?" She says, "Upstairs, in the baby's room." He says, "How do you get in?" She says, "The little door in the back." He runs right to the door in the back. It's quick, short things. He'd go right in there. We'd have this guy cautiously coming up the stairs. Remember, he's an intruder. He doesn't know which door it is. Then he picks up the scent, and he comes in the room, and there's the baby's crib. We get suspense for a moment. The baby's crib, and it's dark. He starts looking around the room, and suddenly he sees two eyes glowing over there. He begins to growl, and his hair bristles. Then you see the form move, and he runs over there. It has to be like a couple of guys fighting in the dark and not knowing where the other guy's is. A hell of a realistic fight there. We can do it in the shadows from the window onto it. Shadow forms against silhouette forms against the light. Certain lighting effects will make it very effective. You actually want to put on a thing like he's a damn good ratter. That's a terrier for you. The rat, of course, always faces him. When the rat moves, he goes, grabs him, gets him, throws him. A nervous thing. When the rat goes over there, he won't go after it. One thing about a ratter. He'll never attack when a rat or a mole is on its back. That is true. That's a great way to get your nose clawed up and bitten. He waits for the thing to get on its feet to go, and he grabs it at the back of the neck. A dog that's not a ratter will just bite him in the stomach, and the rat will get up and go through his cheek with his teeth. The rat gets a death grip on the dog's cheek. Again, that is a brutal, hideous, and beautiful depiction of, in this case, the unintentionally purpose-bred animal. The terrier group are ratters. Extraordinaire. You want rats gone, you want you a terrier. Walt produced 2 more adventure films in England, The Sword and the Rose and Rob Roy. He contemplated 2 other projects to film at the studio, Jules Verne's classic adventure 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Great Locomotive Chase, based on an incident during the American Civil War. Both had special appeal for Walt. The first for Verne's remarkable anticipation of submarines, atomic power, and self-contained underwater suits. The second for its Civil War lore and the chance for him to play with full-size trains. Harper Goff was assigned to create story sketches for both projects, and Walt presented them to a group of visiting theater executives. They decided in favor of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and their preference helped Walt decide to go forward with it. You know, I've never seen 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but if I'm not mistaken, I'm rather familiar with a song from it. It's called A Whale of a Tale, and if I remember correctly, it's Kirk Douglas singing it. Let's see. Given that I've never seen the film, the song kind of reminds me of Jack Sparrow. Captain Jack Sparrow. Let's see if I remember it. And remember, I don't own the rights to any of this music. This is just for fun. Got a whale of a tale to tell you, lads, a whale of a tale or two, like the flapping fish and the girls I've loved on nights like this with the moon above. Whale of a tale, and it's all true, I swear by my tattoo. I think that's probably about as much as I can get away with. The production would be expensive, Walt realized. It required construction of a new stage with a huge tank for underwater filming. Important stars for the 4 leading roles, locations in the Caribbean where water was clear enough for filming, costly effects photography with storms and a monstrous squid, expensive sets, including the submarine Nautilus itself. Because of the cost, Walt was hesitant about mentioning the 20,000 Leagues project to his brother. Later, Walt commented about Roy's surprising reaction. I first told him it was going to cost $3 million with all we had to do. It wasn't contested, and as time went on, I went down to see him and I'd say, "Looks like that thing's going to run $3,300,000. He'd just nod and smile. And then as I kept going along, we got to where it was $3,800,000. He still nodded and smiled. And finally it got to $4,200,000. And he was still smiling. It was the first time he ever did that on a picture. For some reason, he believed in it from the very start. I got worried then. I thought there was something wrong with him, but he just had faith and confidence in it. A special kind of director was needed for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the studio's most ambitious production. Walt and his staff viewed the movies of numerous directors before the choice was narrowed down to 3. Films of each were screened, and Walt asked his staff to vote on a selection. All selected Richard Fischer. "That's fine," Walt commented, "because I've already picked him." Fischer came to the studio, and Walt made the offer for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. "Do you know who my father is?" the director asked. Walt smiled and said that he did. I can just imagine that smile. "I cannot direct the picture unless he gives his permission," Fischer said. "I know he will have strong feelings about it, and I must abide by his decision." "You're absolutely right," Walt said. "Go ahead and ask him." The director's father was Max Fleischer, the pioneering cartoon maker. During his youth, Richard Fleischer had often heard his father inveigh against Walt Disney for borrowing techniques and raiding the Fleischer studio for animators, although Fleischer in turn lured away Disney personnel when he opened an animation studio in Florida. Max Fleischer had sought to make the first sound cartoon and later the first cartoon feature. Both times his releasing company, Paramount, refused approval, and Walt Disney accomplished the innovations. Of course he did. It's Walt Disney. When Richard Fleischer asked if he should go to work for his father's arch rival, Max Fleischer replied, "Of course you should, and tell Walt that I think his judgment is very good." Last night, before the eyes of the world, the 2020 presidential election debate took place on live television. I would like you, my audience, to consider the interaction of these two rivals and reflect on what it means to be a gentleman. And that's all I've got to say about that. For a year, Walt worked with Fleischer and the screenwriter Earl Felton in developing the script of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Harper Goff designed a Nautilus to fit Jules Verne's description of a submarine disguised as a sea monster. The interior, devised by John Meehan, was decorated in a lush Victorian style with velvet-colored furniture and a pipe organ. For the first time, Disney hired important Hollywood stars, James Mason as Captain Nemo, Kirk Douglas as harpooner Ned Land, Paul Lucas as the gentle scientist, Professor Aronnax, Peter Lorre as his assistant Conseil. If you are at all an enthusiast of vintage film, then you know Peter Lorre. If you don't know Peter Lorre, I guarantee you that from Looney Tunes you know Peter Lorre's caricatures. He was the Timothy Spall of his era, the classic sniveling henchman. Think Wormtail, but vintage. I was right, it was Kirk Douglas. Filming began in the clear Caribbean waters near Nassau, then shifted to Jamaica for the Cannibal Island sequence. I've never seen this film, so I say nothing here of its quality or how well it's aged. But given that it's Jules Verne, the company returned to the studio to begin shooting the fight with a giant squid on the newly completed Stage 3 with its 90 by 165-foot tank. As Walt watched the rushes, he realized the scene wasn't working. It was being filmed on a flat sea at sunset. Studio technicians had constructed a realistic squid, but it became unwieldy when the kapok in its tentacles soaked up water. I'm not sure what kapok is. K-A-P-O-K? If you know what it is, please tell me. After a few days shooting, Walt visited the set and told Fleischer, "I want you to start on the dramatic scenes and postpone the squid fight until later. This stuff is awful." The director agreed. "It's phony as a $3 bill. The wires are showing and there's no illusion at all." Production shifted to another stage for interior scenes with the principal actors. Walt put his technicians to work on a more maneuverable and convincing squid. If you know anything about the biology and physiognomy of cephalopods, you realize these fellas were trying to work miracles, some of which are still as yet unexplained by modern biological science. They produced a 2-ton beast with 8 40-foot tentacles and 2 feelers 50 feet long. 28 men were required to animate the squid with hydraulics, compressed air, and electronics. With hideous yellow eyes and a snapping beak, it presented a fearsome menace for Nemo and his submariners. To add to the horror, the squid attack was filmed not in the pink calm of sunset, but in a howling storm. Tons of water hurtled down on the tank, wind machines whipped the spray, and arc lamps sent lightning flashes through the dark. The sequence required 8 days to film and added more than $2,500. Oh, excuse me. $250,000, there's some more zeros there, to the budget. The increased cost strained Roy Disney's warm feelings about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and tried the banker's patience with Walt's spending. He was required to show them the early footage from the film before they would agree to lend him more money. The added expense was a worthwhile investment. The squid fight proved to be the visual highlight of the film. I may have to see if this is on Disney+. The success of true life adventure films prompted naturalists to submit movies to the Disney studio. One of the offerings was 10 minutes of desert film made as part of a doctoral thesis by N. Paul Kenworthy Jr., a student at the University of California at Los Angeles. He had painstakingly photographed a sequence in which a wasp stung a tarantula into paralysis and laid its eggs inside the spider's body. Oh, that's disgusting. When the young wasps hatched, they fed upon the preserved body of the tarantula, then flew off. Ew. "This is good stuff," Walt said enthusiastically when he reviewed the film. "Let's get hold of this young man and set him up out in the desert and see if he can come up with other good stories. We could build the whole thing around the desert." Kenworthy and a colleague, Robert H. Crandall, spent months in the desert filming animal life, and the studio solicited film from other nature photographers. They produced exciting sequences. A family of peccaries, their type of wild porcine, like a kind of a wild pig, treeing a bobcat. A kangaroo rat protecting its young by kicking sand at a sidewinder. A red-tailed hawk in a death battle with a rattlesnake. Walt reviewed the footage and told his producer, Ben Sharpstein, "This is a feature. This is where we can tell a real, sustained story for the first time in these nature pictures." Jim Algar directed The Living Desert and wrote the narration with Ted Sears and Winston Hibler, I'm not sure, who had been the voice of the true life adventures from the beginning. As with the other films, the talk was minimal. The Disney philosophy likened narration to rolling a hoop with a stick. If the film was well edited, the hoop need only an occasional hit to keep it rolling. Predictably, RKO salesmen were opposed to the idea of selling a full-length documentary to theaters, and their reluctance added to the Disney's growing discontent with the distribution company. The sales force was tough and thorough, and the contract terms were favorable, but RKO began to decline in morale and efficiency after Howard Hughes bought control of the company in 1948. Hughes tired of running the film company and offered to give it outright to the Disneys, along with a $10 million bank credit line, but there was a catch. RKO had incurred heavy liabilities during its decline. After a meeting with Hughes to discuss the offer, Walt told Roy, "We've already got a studio. Do we need another one?" With The Living Desert nearing completion, Roy realized that RKO had neither the enthusiasm nor the know-how to sell such an attraction. He established a small sales organization called Buena Vista, and after the street where the studio was located. The Living Desert was first booked into the Sutton Theater in New York, along with a cartoon featurette, Ben and Me. It was an immediate success, and Buena Vista added salesmen and released The Living Desert in a careful, deliberate way throughout the country. Proportionately, it became the biggest profit maker in Disney history, earning $4 million after a production cost of $300,000. I can't do math very well, so feel free to map out your own proportions there. Howard Hughes's neglect of RKO had caused the company to deteriorate rapidly, and Roy decided to seek another distributor for the studio's product. He and Card Walker went to New York for discussions with the major film companies, and the results were discouraging. Although the companies were eager to have the prestige of the Disney name, their terms seemed excessive. The distributor naturally favored its own studio's product, giving less favorable playdates to the independent producers. Roy summoned the key salesmen of Buena Vista and told them they had proved with The Living Desert that they could distribute a film successfully. Roy pointed out that the company had two attractions of great promise: 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Lady and the Tramp. Now, if you have the guts and the vision and are willing to work, do you want to go forward with our own distribution company? Roy asked. The salesman readily agreed, and thereafter all the Disney films were distributed by Buena Vista. I believe the Buena Vista name still figures quite heavily at Walt Disney World. While The Living Desert proved an immense success with the public, some reviewers in intellectual journals criticized its anthropomorphism. This was a growing trend as the Disney product became more popular and more diverse. The same kind of critic who had embraced the Disney cartoons in the 1930s began to attack Disney films as sentimentalized and corny. Walt was at first perplexed, then hurt by the critiques, some of which seemed political in nature. One evening, as the studio nurse was applying the heat treatment to Walt's neck, he grumbled about a bad review the New Yorker had given a Disney film. Hazel George answered him, "Why should you care what those urban hicks say?" "What did you call them?" Walt asked. "Urban hicks." Walt laughed with delight and said admiringly to Hazel, "That's what an education will do for you." Now that was a mighty short chapter, and I don't think I'm ready to say goodbye just yet. The world's in a tough place right now. We all are. The debate last night, the fallout thereafter, the current occupant of Pennsylvania Avenue, and as they say here, all this stuff going on, a global pandemic, record unemployment, and just everyone being mean to each other. I have a message for you. A deep, abiding, I would hope, heartfelt message. I love y'all. No, really. If you can look at your neighbor and hate him for no reason, then I can look into this camera at each and every one of you and love you for no reason. Do you understand me? The next time you look at your neighbor, love them for no reason. Please. Y'all didn't think I was going to get away from this one without crying, did you? All right, a bit of fortification. Now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you. M-O-U-S-E. With all my love, y'all take care of yourselves, okay?